All right, so welcome everyone to our event today. Um, this event is called The Making of a Visual Archive. I'm going to start off with a land acknowledgement before we begin. Actually, first of all, my name is Mosca, and I am the archivist for the Muslims in Canada archive, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. But I'd like to begin with this land acknowledgement that specifically reflects where I live and work and where the University of Toronto resides. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I live and work on Toronto, often known as Toronto. I acknowledge that these lands have been stolen from its caretakers, and I acknowledge my own role as a settler in continuing the legacy of colonial violence and genocide. I also acknowledge that for some racialized non-Indigenous peoples, coming to Turtle Island was not a choice. We'd also like to acknowledge that our workshop facilitator and speaker, Alia Youssef, is currently located on unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So again, everyone, welcome. Today we'll begin with some introduction. So I'll introduce our wonderful guest and facilitator, Alia Youssef, who I mentioned just a moment ago. I'll also very briefly touch on the Muslims in Canada archive, which I also mentioned earlier, and talk a little bit about traditional institutional archives and archiving. Alia will then discuss visual storytelling as an archival intervention, and will give us some really great pointers on how you can be a visual storyteller. Finally, we'll open the space up for a Q&A to the audience, and we'll have a slide with our contact info at the end as well. So without further ado, I'd like to more formally introduce our guest and co-facilitator, Alia Youssef. Alia is a Vancouver-based portrait and documentary photographer interested in complicating representations of marginalized groups and national narratives, as well as highlighting underrepresented stories and histories. Her personal projects have been exhibited in solo and group shows at prominent galleries and festivals across Canada, such as Prefix Institute of Contemporary Art, the Ryerson Image Center Student Gallery, the Parliament of Canada, Presentation House Gallery, and Nuit Blanche Toronto. Her commercial projects with global brands have been displayed internationally, including in New York's Times Square and London's Piccadilly Circus. Her work has been published in numerous online and print publications, including the Globe and Mail, Maclean's, the Narwhal, and Elle magazine. Alia has done many public artist talks, most notably for the Aga Khan Museum, We Day Toronto, and Instagram. She completed the Master of Fine Arts in Documentary Media program at Ryerson University and was awarded the Ryerson University Gold Medal. Welcome, Alia.
Thank you.
And as I mentioned earlier, I am your co-facilitator, Mosca, and I'm the archivist for the Muslims in Canada archive, MICA for short. MICA is a collaborative and participatory initiative at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto, providing a platform for that missing Muslim voice in Canada. So we implement a community-driven participatory approach to preserving the history and documentary heritage of Muslims in Canada. We ensure that Canadian Muslims inform how we represent them and how we tell their stories. And actually, MICA came about as an intervention and solution to the lack of an active effort to counter skewed representations in mainstream media about Canadian Muslims, and also the lack of a centralized space to preserve and share the histories of Canadian Muslims. Sorry, one second. To understand the importance of MICA and contemporary interventions, like I mentioned, into traditional mainstream archiving, it's important to go over how Canada's documentary heritage has been preserved until now. Very basically, the documentary heritage of Canada is reflected in the papers and photographs and VHS tapes and what have you, and other records that are gathered, collected, and preserved in an archival institution. So these records are primary sources of Canada's history, the activities of the Canadian government and Canadian society as a whole. The gathering, collection, and preservation of these documents and records is the practice of archiving. Traditionally, archives have been attached to major institutions such as governments, so federal, provincial, municipal, universities and colleges, and major faith-based institutions like Canadian churches. So this is a picture on your left of Library and Archives Canada. So this is Canada's kind of national archive, and they hold records of national significance, so of Canadians and organizations of national significance. And the photo on the right is the Irving K. Barber Learning Center, where the UBC archives are held. So these are just, I just had these photos here because these are just some examples of institutions that would have major holdings and records preserved over decades and decades of the institutions, since the institution's beginnings, honestly. These types of institutions, long-standing and often, like I said, decades, hundreds of years old, are what have traditionally done the memory work, the history making of Canada. And as almost anything in Canada, these institutions come from Western Eurocentric systems. They come from Europe, where many days traditional archival professional principles and practices were born. The issue with that is that these systems benefit the majority kind of white Christian centered Canadians. And that's what we see in these major archival institutions. So there's a disproportionate amount of records preserved created by white individuals, organizations, many who are also like largely Christian. And because of the lack of histories on non-majority groups, a lot of stories about Muslims in Canada in the past can be glimpsed through one example, through different sources. So one example being newspaper archives. Could you go to the next slide for that, Alia? Thank you. So these are just some clippings that I found from the Toronto Star, so a very old newspaper here in Toronto. So this is just an example, and so this is a very common story and image that you'd find in newspapers back in the 60s and 70s. Whenever they cover Muslims, for some reason, these news outlets really like taking photos of Muslims prostrating in prayer or as like a quintessential image of the Muslim. But the newspapers, they do, however, provide small snapshots of what life was like for Canadian Muslims at in those times. So, for example, the left, the clipping on the left is of a man. It says a London man summons Muslims to prayer, and that one's from 1959. The second one is from the second and third are from 1977. So newspapers, they do provide, like I said, those small snapshots, but it's not the same. It's not the same as capturing, the whole of a Muslim individual's story through their records, photographs, documents, and other personal items. Could you go to the next slide? Thank you. But that also doesn't mean that you can't search and find some records here and there by or about Muslims in the major archival institutions that I talked about. Sometimes though, when you do see Muslims come up, the story around them is really often it's usually centered around violence, war, poverty, terrorism, and supposed barbaric cultural practices. So the first photo you see on the left is when you go onto the Library and Archives Canada collections search. So you search through their collections, and you just type in Muslim. All I did was type in Muslim, and the very first first result is this drawing by somebody that's located in somebody's collection. Their name is David Anderson. And it seems to be a drawing of some violence occurring in Croatia and related to the Bosnian Serbs at this, Bosnian Serbs over, it says Bosnian Serbs over unsafe haven Muslims hold on to, et cetera, et cetera. So again, like another example of, the very first result being a violent a violent situation related to Muslims. The second image is from the BC archives. I know, again, I just typed in Muslims, and the first image that you see is the Komagata Maru, which was a ship that held, I guess, like I said, six Hindus and Muslims. And again, another kind of, another image just related to poverty and just violence, just negativity, honestly. These are just examples of what comes up when you do searches and how Muslims are seen in archives right now. And though major archival institutions are trying to rectify the lack of records by non-majority groups, like Muslims, for example, they have an enormous task ahead of them, because they'll find that archives and memory work manifest so differently for many non-majority groups. For this reason, interventions into Canada's archival record, its history and memory are crucial through alternative record keeping and storytelling methods, through community archives like MICA, and actually interventions such as visual storytelling that is central to our guest Alia's work. And speaking of her work, another example of a search that comes up when you go through the Library and Archives Canada collections search, when you search Muslim family, this is the image that comes up. So this image is titled "Woman Beg Outside Mosque in Kandahar City." Another example of how Muslim stories are framed by narratives of damage, war, and poverty. And this is also an image from across the world. It's not related to, supposedly not related to Canadian Muslim life either, but we see it here as the only image that comes up. I'll end off by emphasizing the importance of Canadian Muslims telling their own stories in their own words and their own ways, whether that's through your records preserved by an archive like MICA or through alternative methods, one of those being visual storytelling, which we'll get into today. So I'll pass it off onto you, Alia, to get us started.
Thanks so much, Mosca, for that really in-depth introduction to this and contextualizing the work that I do. It's so wonderful to be able to have someone who works very closely with archives be able to shed context on a topic that I've been working with so intimately over the past 5 years. So I just, first of all, before I get into everything, just wanted to thank everybody so much for spending a few hours of their evening with me. I know that December is an extremely busy time of year for so many people, whether you're in school or not. And so spending this time with me is something that I really am grateful for. And I hope that that whatever you've come to this talk for, that I am able to speak on it. But if I don't, I am going to leave some time at the end for discussion. So I would love it if you dropped your questions at the end so we can have a little bit of a discussion. So I've been a photographer for over 10 years now and have worked on many different projects with many different topics. Around 5 years ago, I began being interested in how Muslim women were represented in the media. And this is all because as I was growing up, I just simply didn't see Muslim women represented in the media that I was consuming. And whenever I did, it would happen to be like on the news when my parents were watching the news, or walking by a newspaper in the supermarket or something like that. And when I would see representations in those kind of platforms, they would always be negative and always be about, terrorists on the other side of the world, or, in justifying wars so that certain countries could be invaded, and stories like this. And so it kind of really painted a picture for me growing up that the only way that people saw Muslims were in a negative light. So 5 years ago, I decided that as a portrait photographer and someone who loves photographing women, if I could do something to combat all of these one-dimensional stereotypes that I kept seeing about Muslim women. all the images that I would see of Muslim women were Muslim women are oppressed, Muslim women are at the will of their male counterparts, all Muslim women wear the hijab or the niqab, and all Muslim women are Arab. And it was just kind of this one image that got stamped on every single Muslim woman. And I knew that this wasn't true. I knew that when I looked at community members around me that this wasn't the case. And I knew that there should be an alternate way of an alternative to this, and that as a portrait photographer, maybe I could do something about it. So this project that I'm currently referencing isn't Generations, but I wanted to speak on it to give context to how I got to working on Generations. And so that project that I was talking about was called the Sisters Project, and I ended up photographing 160 women over the span of 3 or 4 years in 12 cities across Canada. And there was this one summer in 2018 when I actually spent a month or a month and a half traveling to all these different cities and photographing Muslim women all across the country. And it was pretty intense. I was photographing women, 3 to 4 times a day. So it was like I was constantly meeting new people and hearing their stories. And something that was so interesting to me while I was doing that was that I would meet these women and they would invite me to their community spaces, or they would invite me to their mosque, or they would invite me to spend time with them at their family home and meet their mom or their grandmother. And they would share these stories about how their family came to Canada and the contributions that their family has done, and essentially share their family histories with me. And this was something that really touched me over that time that I was working on the project. And I realized, something pretty profound during that, which is I'm someone who's working on projects relating to Muslim identity, Muslims in Canada, yet I didn't know any of these histories that they were sharing with me. I didn't know about when the first mosque in Edmonton was created, or how far into history Muslim presence in Canada has been. I didn't know these things, and I especially didn't know anything related to this while I was growing up. And I thought to myself, if I had, how much would that have affected my sense of belonging as I grew up? And so I started researching this a little bit more, this idea of like, there's so much history here in Canada, that so much Muslim Canadian history, yet where is it? Who is writing about it? Where can I see it? And so then I started doing research in archives, and Mosca wonderfully illustrated what I found when I would do this research. And essentially what I found was absence, because the photographs that Mosca shared, they're one of very few. So that is what you do see, but for the most part, it's what you don't see. And you don't see a lot. Essentially, there was a massive void when it came to any representation on Muslims in Canada, and especially Muslim women in Canada. And then, so I would look up, okay, what are the representations non-visually? Who has written about Muslim communities over time? And, gratefully, there are books, and there are our history has been documented in majority by Muslim community members, but also in majority it's by Muslim men. And so there were not many women who were contributing to history. And this is nothing surprising. A statistic that really stuck with me while I was working on this project was actually that of all of global history, only 0.5% of history is actually from a woman's perspective or about women's stories. And so this is, an incredibly small number, but yet it's not very surprising, because the point of view and perspective in our everyday media is that of mostly white men. And in recent years, there are a lot of people who are trying to disrupt this, but for most of history, this has been the case. Anyway, so all that is to say, this is the context in which I created Generations. So Generations is a photography series that I created because of all of this, where I photographed 29 families in 6 cities across Canada. And I photographed them all on film because I realized that the history of so-called Canada and the history of photography and the history of Muslim presence in Canada actually all followed a very strikingly similar timeline. And I realized that most of this absence that I'm discussing is actually from a pre-digital time. And so it was during the film age where there was this massive absence of Muslim representation. And so I almost wanted to reclaim film photography as a medium to also reclaim our history and our representation. And so me and my film camera went across Canada once again, getting to meet Muslim families, Muslim women of multiple generations who wanted to share their histories and their stories so that they could be archived in a new counter archive. So the first family that I wanted to talk about is actually this one that you've all been staring at for the past like 5 minutes, which is the Hamden family. And I wanted to start by talking about the Hamden family because I was very excited when I was able to connect with them because of their significance in the history books when it comes to Muslim communities and Muslim Canadian history. Hilary Hamden, who is the beautiful woman in this frame, is actually if you were to, think of who one of the pioneering figures in Muslim Canadian history are, it would be Hilary Hamden's name would come up time and time again because she was the woman who spearheaded the creation and the building of the first mosque in Canada, which is in Edmonton. And, this is what she is mostly remembered for. But if you talk to her family, you find out about the contributions that she did throughout her entire lifetime. She was a central figure and a pillar to the Muslim communities in Edmonton. And I really wanted to go to Edmonton so that I could meet her family. So in the photograph beside it, you see her daughter-in-law and her granddaughters holding the frame in front of the mosque that she helped build. And so it was incredible getting to meet this family, getting to interview them, and getting to photograph them at such a significant place in this historical timeline. And so that's where this begins. And then so after that, I just went all across the country asking people, mostly people who I'd had conversations with before, what are families that you know of that you believe have a significant story that should be remembered, that should be archived, and that should be told? And I got responses from all over. And so I'm going to share some of the families now that I got to photograph in this process. So I won't talk about every family because all night, but I will discuss a few of them in more detail. But something I did want to mention was that something that was really important to me was creating a space where the women in these photographs got to assert how they would like to be visually represented, because that's often something that Muslim women haven't had the ability to do, is actually to have ownership over how they're represented. So I really wanted this to become a collaborative process, and that's something that I've always valued in all of the projects that I create. And so things, the location of the images was something that we discussed. A family history is so massive. Like you could, there's so many different aspects of a family history that you can talk about. And it's so hard as someone who's creating a project that, is going to end up writing maybe a page-long biography, what do you stress upon? And so I thought that not to let myself be the person who chooses that, but to actually ask each family that I photographed, what is it that you want to be remembered about your family? And what is it that you would like to stress upon, whether it be the challenges you faced or what you're most proud of, or your reflections on how things have changed throughout the generations in this particular city that you live in. Each family had a different thing that they wanted to talk about and that they wanted, recorded. I've stopped on the Badawi family from Halifax because the Badawi family was actually one of the largest families that I ended up photographing for the project. A majority of the photos that you'll notice showcase 2, 3, 4 people. But this was an incredible photo shoot because there was 12 people that got to be a part of it. And getting to meet this family was incredible, as this family has been in Halifax since 1970, and have since, obviously, many generations, the generations have grown with this family with that time, but this family is the type of family that just gives and gives and is always a part of things, that always likes to contribute. And so, any topic that you talk about in Halifax, or any community that you talk about, someone in this family has somehow been a part of it or somehow contributed to it. So it's pretty amazing to be able to have records of the contributions that families have made all across Canada. And something that else was very interesting was being able to go to different cities and talk about what it was like for their families when they first arrived in those particular cities, because it's very different from Quebec to Alberta to Ottawa. It's all very different experiences. And that was very interesting to find out, because especially when I was talking to people who currently live in Quebec, it was interesting to see how many differences there actually was as time moved on, and how much they could reflect on what their family has seen from when they first came to Canada to now. And is it better, or is it worse, or what's changed and what's similar? So these kinds of conversations were also being had. So I think I'm just going to continue to sharing photos. Something else that I would love to mention is that with this project, I wasn't necessarily always trying to find families who had been here the longest time. I wanted diversity in many different aspects. So there's a large cultural diversity, which you'll notice throughout the photos. There's a large diversity of how the families present themselves, whether sometimes they wear cultural attire or religious symbols, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes you can actually reflect those differences within a single image between generations. And as well, some of the families came in the early 1900s, and some of them immigrated to Canada past the 2000s. So there's a large, timeline in when these different families came to Canada. And because of that, much diversity when it comes to the reflections that they have when speaking about the context of Muslims in Canada. Alrighty, so I think this brings me on to talk less about me and my project, and more so about the importance of visual storytelling in general, and also encouraging you all, hopefully, to create some visual stories for yourself. So, you've probably pieced it together, but I feel very strongly about visual storytelling and its importance. And I really believe it's important because for the majority of history, which I mentioned, the stories that have circulated have been through the perspective of white folks and men for the most part. And I think this is really the time now for us to reclaim the stories that haven't been told, and to be sharing our own perspectives, because our own individual perspectives and our own individual intersections of our own identities are worth being shared. And I think anybody can really create their own counter archive or counter representation. And sometimes you're countering absence, or sometimes you're countering stereotypes, or sometimes you're just saying, hey, I don't feel like this story that relates to me. I've seen this before. And what we do when we create these stories is that we end up asserting our own belonging into whatever community or whatever space that we don't feel like has been represented. And it affects this generation that we're a part of today, but it also impacts to a very large part the generations that come after this, and their sense of belonging and their sense of citizenship and their sense of feeling sure of themselves in whatever aspect of their identity that you are sharing and talking about. And it doesn't have to be about religion and culture. It can be about any different aspect of our complicated human experience. So I wanted to just give some ideas of different kinds of visual stories. Not all visual stories are the same, and there can be a big variety in the types of visual stories that you'll see. And actually, I have some examples coming up that are wildly different from my project and also wildly different from each other. So I think, a visual story can be as simple as just documenting a time in a place or an event in a place. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to have this deep meaning. It can simply be documentation. And that doesn't make it any less great as something that does have a strong conceptual meaning or strong social justice, plan or whatever. So I just wanted to state that. Also, our stories can simply be for the purpose of connecting to one another on subjects of our shared humanity. As I said, we live such complicated, complex lives, and whatever we can do to connect with one another, I think we're all better off for it. We can shed light and attention on issues that are little known. I believe that to a certain degree, my project does this in a sense where I don't think people quite think about representation and archives and our histories as much as I necessarily do. And I think talking about this project makes people think about it more and think about how their communities are represented in the past and in the present. Another reason is to counter stereotypes and standards that are perpetuated, which is definitely, I think, the main thing that I try to do in my work. And in a more activist sense, you can also create a visual story so that you can ignite change or bring people to action. There have been plenty of stories that ask for people to donate or to change their habits or to call attention to an urgent issue that's happening in our news cycle that people need to be thinking about. So there's such a diversity in what we can create visual stories about, and whatever idea that you possibly have in the back of your head is a valid reason to do a visual story. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what makes a beautiful visual story. So this is a workshop or a talk about visual representation, visual storytelling. So I thought I would spend the rest of our time together talking about the visual component of stories. So I believe there are 3 different aspects of what goes into making a beautiful visual story, and why really I believe anyone can actually make beautiful visual stories, whether you are a trained photographer or not. I think what's most important is a personal connection to the theme or the story that you are exploring. And if you don't necessarily have an intense personal connection to it, a curiosity about the subject matter. Because if you're not curious and you're not connected to it, it's probably not the story for you. But if you are, then you're already a couple steps into the process of making the story, because you're probably already thinking about it in connection with people who are in that particular communities. You're already embedded in a sense in whatever the story is. Another aspect that's really important is having a unique angle or perspective that you are focusing on. Is this what story can you share that we haven't heard of before? And it doesn't have to be wildly different and wildly unique. It's just sharing the way you see it, and the way you see the story is bound to be unique because you have your own perspective and your own bias and your own subjectivity, and therefore everything that you create is bound to be unique. And of course, lastly, the visuals are so important, and they should be captivating and interesting. And I know that can seem very daunting, but I hope throughout this talk that we break down that a little bit more so that it doesn't seem quite as daunting to be like, how do I make a visual captivating and interesting? So I wanted to show some examples first. Louisa Dore is a photographer that I have admired for a very, very long time. I first noticed her work when she photographed for Time magazine using only her iPhone. It was an incredible project. She photographed the firsts of essentially women who did certain things first. And that's really all I can say about it, because all the women that were in that project were wildly different and diverse from each other, but they are the first to do something. And she went all around meeting these incredible people with just her iPhone. And the photos she created were stunning. And it showed me that beautiful images and beautiful stories don't need to be complicated. They don't need to have complicated equipment, and it can just be simply done with your phone. So because of that, I started following her very, deeply, and I started finding out about her other projects. And now I love to use her as an example. And now I love to also show the majority of the work that in this slideshow and other slideshows that I do are actually taken with a phone, so that you can see that amazing images can be done using accessible equipment. So this story here that I'm going to show you is the Faleras. So Luisa Dor was in Spain and decided to document the Fallas de Valencia festival, which is a massive street festival and a very important tradition that happens in Valencia, Spain. And of course, it's incredibly visually interesting, but it's a tradition that spans a huge period of time, a huge period of history. And she was showing how this tradition has changed with time and has become more diverse with time. So she focused on the important custom of women who are elected to represent their neighborhood during this festival and what they wear as a part of this festival. So she went, and I believe with her phone, to photograph women in these elaborate and incredible dresses. And she also complemented these portraits with taking these detailed photos of specific objects of importance. And the reason why I wanted to show this is because in this visual story that Luisa has done, she's really used a lot of different strategies to create this visual story. She's taking portraits, she's doing these close-up photos of items that are important, and she's also going out on the streets and documenting it. So it kind of shows like a very different story to my own, where my visual stories, they often are portraits that look quite similar and follow like a very kind of similar rule book, where in this story you see that she's mixing portraits with close-up images, with documentary style images, and they all come together in a way that's still very cohesive and still very beautiful. And now I'm going to share a very different story. This is The Brown Sisters by Nicholas Nixon, and this is a photo series that I've always found very intriguing because of its simplicity, because what makes it extremely interesting is not necessarily how complicated the images are, but the time that was put into it. So for this particular visual story, Nicholas Nixon photographed his wife and her three sisters over 42 years. And he always just photographed them in these simple poses. And he only spent half an hour with them every year. But because they were his family, he was able to have access to them over a very long period of time. And what I find super interesting about this series of images is that it compresses time. You see themes of, relationships and how they change, the way the women interact with each other over time, and how they get closer with age. Like if you look at the earlier images, there's some more distance between them. But as you go to their older images, you see that they become much more snuggly and much more close with one another. And it kind of signals that their relationships have enriched over time. And it also kind of highlights the process of aging, and it talks about that. And I think a lot of women can look at this series and see themselves in either the facial expressions or the emotions, or relate to the aging process, or whatever it is, fruitfully looking at the faces of these women. It's incredible how much we can relate to people we don't know or don't even know much about in photographs, because of the subtle themes that come out of them. And you know, as I said, like what makes this series very particularly interesting is just how is just the relation of each photo to one another. If you just saw one photo, it wouldn't necessarily be that interesting, but it's the relationship that all the photos have to each other. And when you see them as a whole, that makes them so striking. So I showed you 3 different stories, visual stories that are all wildly different and that use all very different types of storytelling languages. But I kind of wanted to break down now how you can create beautiful images, equipment that you have access to. So as you can see, there are so many different kinds of stories and different ways to take them, like mine and Nicholas Nixon's work, you know, portraits and going in a very expansive direction. Like for me, it was about photographing a lot of different women and a lot of different families, but with Nicholas Nixon, it was expansive in its timeline. But you can also do things very differently, like Louisa Dore, where you just combine snapshots of different things together to create a story that is enriched by seeing different things, different elements, and not necessarily they all be portraits or close-ups of items or documentary photos. Like it's the mix of the photos that enriches the project. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, what makes a great image and what you can do to make your images look a little bit better if you're struggling with that. I'm sure there are also some great photographers in this room that probably don't need these tips, but they're here anyway. So I think if you break down how to make a great image, you really should pay attention to 4 things. Actually, I would say 3 things because 2 of those could kind of be combined into one. So lighting is, I would say, the most important aspect of an image and something that I always will reiterate to people as the thing that you need to be the most mindful of. Then there's the composition and framing of the image. And then there's the emotion or the connection that you have to the person or thing that you are photographing. So something that I want to talk about before I get too much into lighting is this idea that I think people don't realize that photography is actually a very mindful practice. And I think we forget this because often we're just taking our iPhone out and we're just snapping a picture and snapping a picture there, and we're hardly even looking at the photo as we're taking it. But if you go back in time and actually would shoot on film where you only have 20 pictures on a roll, everything slows a lot down because you can't just take 100 photos. You have to actually look at the photo, and every photo really counts. And I think that way of doing photography is profoundly different for how we take photos now. And I think everybody benefits from almost going back in time and embracing the way that people used to take photos. So I say it's a mindful practice because it's all about looking and taking in your environment and noticing your surroundings. And this can happen even when you're indoors. You don't necessarily have to be outdoors to notice your surroundings. So when I'm taking photos, I like to show up to a place and just look. Don't even take my camera out. I just stand there and just look around. And I notice, what is the light like right now? You know, is it coming from a certain direction, which it always is, because our sun is always moving. What direction is it coming in? Is it really harsh, or is it really soft because it's cloudy? Or if I'm indoors, what window is giving us the most light? Or if there are no windows, what is the prominent light source in this room? And I notice, where is this light coming from and how will this affect my images? If you pay attention to where the light is coming from, what direction, then you'll know when you're taking your photo, where you need to place the person you are photographing or the thing that you are photographing, because images tend to be a lot better, especially when we are photographing with our phones, when the light is facing your subject. So if you see in these images, there's many different kinds of light in between these 3 images. So we have one that's taken at golden hour. There's one that's taken at, I don't know, like middle of the day. in the middle, and then there's one taken on a cloudy day. And something to note about cloudy days is that a lot of people think, oh, it's cloudy, so I don't need to worry about where the light's coming because it's all flat anyway. But actually, even on a cloudy day, you'll still notice that the light is brighter from one direction than another. So it's always important to notice where the light is coming from, even when it doesn't seem like there's obviously light coming from any direction. And so I always tell people, notice the light and face your subject towards the light. And if you can't do that, see if you can find somewhere or something to reflect the light back onto your subject. So photographers will often use a reflector, but if you want, you can even find a white piece of foam core or a wall that's white or something that's reflective that brings light back onto the person or thing that you are photographing. So I think like that is the most important thing that I want to stress when we're taking photos, is just to simply notice the light. And then once you've noticed it, see what you can do to utilize the light to the best degree that you can in that situation that you are in. And I wanted to show you all some indoor photos too. Unfortunately, these are not taken on my iPhone, though I wanted to have some examples of indoor ones. But these ones are taken on just my regular camera. In these situations, I was in a dark thrift store and a dark office. And I know they don't seem dark right now, but in both the situations, I found where the light was coming from. So in the thrift store photo, the light is coming from above the mirror. And I took her to that pool of light so that she could be lit within it, and faced her towards the mirror because the mirror was adding additional bounce of light onto her face. And so that was me going to the thrift store and noticing where is the best light in this place. And of course, whenever you have natural light streaming in, that is the best place for the photo. And in the other one, this was also like a dark office, and I wanted to photograph her walking with her baby. But what was important is that I needed her face to look towards the window, because if it wasn't towards the window, then her face would be in shadow. So it's these simple things like considerations that I think make a really big difference to how your photo ends up in the end, because you don't want your person you're photographing or the thing that you're photographing to be in shadow or to be too dark if it's not on purpose. Of course, there are always silhouette shots, which I'll show you later, where you intentionally choose for your subject to be dark in the image. But for the most part, I know that most photographers and most people who are photographing their family or their community or their friends, they want the person they're photographing to be lit nice, and they want to create beautiful photos of those people. So that's just something to consider when you're creating photos of the people around you. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about framing. And so I think for the most part, when we're out shooting with our iPhones or with our cameras even, we just see, like, we want to take a photo of the person we're with, and then the background could be like maybe like a nice, like, I'm just thinking, I live in Vancouver and I live right by Science World, and it's a very interesting structure, and I see a lot of people taking photos in front of it. But I think people are just very quick to take out their photo, get a snap, and then not really think much about it. But I think there's so much there's so much benefit in looking around and seeing if there are interesting ways that you can frame your image, or interesting architectural elements surrounding you that can enhance the way that your image looks. And so I just wanted to show a few examples of like interesting ways you can play with your environment to make the framing more interesting. So with these images in front of you, with the train shot, most people, I think, would take a picture of the person and make sure, this is all on a phone, tap the person in the image, and then what they would probably end up is with a very yellow image where the window behind it is all blown out and it's all white, and it just wouldn't be that interesting. But what I found really interesting about this photographer is she utilized this idea of negative space and actually just embracing the fact that and tapped on the window and just let everything fall out of silhouette. And so then most of this image is actually comprised of negative space, and the only real positive space in this image where we're actually seeing subject matter is in the window beyond her. But it creates for such a fascinating image. So I guess I'd like to always tell people, don't be afraid of selecting on your phone the, the non-expected thing to focus on, because sometimes you get very interesting images that utilize negative space in a very fascinating way. And this is the same thing that is happening in this other image of the little boy kicking the ball, is that once again, the photographer could have chosen to just focus on the child playing, and then the light probably would have been all funny, and everything in the background would have been all blown out. But once again, they selected the background to be what they tapped on, and it made the child go all silhouette. And therefore, it was actually created a more dynamic and graphic image, because the child became suddenly the image became more about the negative space surrounding the child. So I thought those are really two really interesting iPhone photos that kind of show how you can really play with the positive and negative space and the way you frame the image. And this is where I like to talk about framing in a more literal way, because I love the idea of framing things, framing subject matter through certain things in the environment. Because what I find super interesting about this is that it actually gives you the ability to tell multiple stories in your image. So there's the story of whatever the subject matter is, but what you choose to frame that subject matter through. So in one case, it's the bicycle wheel, and in another case, it's the chain fence. It actually adds another element to the story that you're telling. And so using framing as a device to make your photos more interesting is actually also a storytelling opportunity in itself. And so I just absolutely love that this photographer, David, decided to shoot through one of the children's bicycle wheel as an added element to showcase like the activities that they're participating in. And this one through the fence is also just super fascinating. And he also put the subject matter in the third line of the image, which always makes the focus of whatever subject matter you're photographing stand out more. And then I went to show a few photos where I actually decided to frame something through other people. So other people became the framing device. So you can actually still do this, even though these photos are taken on my digital camera. You can still do this with your iPhone, because I think most phones that are out now have portrait mode. And I know when portrait mode came out, I was so excited because I could finally on my phone make things go out of focus that I didn't want in focus. But this is something that you can do with that mode very easily. And sometimes it's really nice to just have the edges of your images actually have like blurred out people or things, so that you can really focus on what's most important in the image or what you want to showcase within the image. So this is another way that you can think about framing. So you don't always have to find the most interesting like objects to work with. Sometimes you can just work with like people who are around that happen to be there when you're taking the photo. And some more iPhone photos that I love. These photos, the one on they both utilize reflection, obviously, and reflection is a very great device to use if you can use it. You know, if you're in Vancouver like me and it's raining all the time, you always have the opportunity to create some puddle reflection, which I totally encourage you to take advantage of. But if you're in like downtown Toronto, you'll find that the office buildings there are all pretty much like glass, and you always have opportunity to use reflection to make your photos a little bit more interesting. So I wanted to always encourage you, when you're doing your mindful looking around as you're taking photos, also notice, are there any reflective surfaces or anything that I can utilize? And on this photo on the right, where you can see like there's a symmetrical line, and you can almost see the top and the bottom image, part of the image as the same. In this image, the photographer is using symmetry as well. And that's also with reflective surfaces can be very interesting when you actually divide your shot. And so that you can almost see it completely, you can almost see the same shot doubled. And I find that's always, whenever you see an image like that, it's always fascinating. You can't really go wrong with using that. And so This brings me to another aspect of being mindful when you're taking photos is often I find with, and this is even with professional photographers, all people, is that we always forget that our eye level doesn't have to be the only way we see the world. I think, we go through the world, whenever we take our phones out or our cameras out, we often think, oh, I'm going to photograph this particular object just from this because this is our default, this is our default angle that we see the world. But actually the world can be a lot more interesting if we get a little lower or if we get a little higher, and to switch it up so that not all of our photos are always taken at eye level. And if you're photographing people, actually, this is something that you really want to consider because, see, I'm very short. So I'm always very mindful of my height in comparison to other people's height and how I can try to get to their eye level. But then a lot of photographers are extremely tall and have the opposite problem as me, where they often forget that they shouldn't shoot down at people and that they should lower so that they're photographing people at eye level. So that's always something to keep in mind, is that when you're photographing portraits, you always kind of have to be mindful of what angle you're shooting people at. But this is one of my favorite images that I wanted to show because it's just one of those things where we've all done it. We're all walking in cities for the most part, and we see pigeons all the time and we just don't think anything of them. Or if you're my sister, you think that they're spying on us or whatever, like the pigeon conspiracy theories. Anyway, I think like it's so amazing that this photographer decided to get so low to the ground that he was able to make the pigeon look almost like it was walking alongside these businessmen, like it was also just commuting to work. And it's just like something you would never think about if when you're just standing up, just looking down at the concrete, you just would never think that you would be able to see like an image like this, but it's actually just escaping the way you see the world normally, and changing your perspective it can make almost a whole new story. That's how impactful sometimes changing your angle can be, which is the case, of course, with this image, is that a whole new story was created that could not have been created if it was taken at any other angle. So these are two iPhone photos that I love to show to just illustrate two different angles and what it can do for portraits. So with this angle where my sister is playing tennis, the really great thing about getting really low to the ground often is that you often find lines. So whether it's lines in the street or lines in shadows or lines in concrete, like, there are, our ground is just filled with lines everywhere. And often when you get really low to the ground, you can actually make the lines point to the subject matter that you're photographing. And so it doesn't matter if it's a portrait or not, if you're photographing a building or a statue or whatever it may be, getting low to the ground and having the lines lead to your subject matter can make for a very impactful image. And it just makes the subject matter that you're photographing stand out so much more. And so that's another benefit to getting really low to the ground. I mean, I could go on and on. If you see any behind the scenes image doing photo shoots, I'm always laying and sitting on the ground. It's just one of those things. I can't wear nice things when I'm taking photos because I'm always just getting them muddy and dirty. And on the other hand, on this other image of my sister, I'm shooting way down at her. We're pretty much looking directly down. And this is an angle that we often see, not with portraits, but more so with like food photos. Like, the standard, you can all think of it, like looking down at your plate, seeing what people are eating or whatever. Photographers will call it flay image because you're looking directly flat onto a surface. And that is primarily how you usually see high angle photos in everyday life, like when you're scrolling Instagram or you're opening a magazine or whatever. That's kind of the images that you usually see. But it can also be very interesting with portraits and with other things. And so my only disclaimer, of course, to this angle is that when you're looking down at people, it's very easy to make them look inferior because of that angle. So if you can recall back to that image that Mosca showed of the free women who were in Kandahar city from the archives, I don't know if you can recall, but it was a photographer actually took a photo looking down at them. So they were all sitting on the street and the photographer was looking down at these women. And something that really bothered me about that image when I saw it was how the photographer didn't take the time or the effort to get to these women's eye level and to actually photograph them as human beings. Instead, he photographed them as just honestly something to look down upon. And so that's something really to be mindful of when you're photographing, especially people from this angle, is that you often want them to just lift their face or to lift their face or their eye level so that they're still parallel to the camera. So if you can see with this image, my sister's face is still very parallel to the image. So therefore, we're not really looking down at her because she is meeting us. Her gaze is meeting us. So that's just something that I wanted to note. This angle, though, it can be used for such exciting images. And so I definitely encourage you to test out going low or going high. And what I really love to do, especially when I'm photographing families or photographing community members, I don't necessarily get as low as I do with this tennis image, but if you think about how every queen or king or royalty or president has ever been photographed, they're always photographed where you're looking up at them because they're this high almighty figure that people have to look up upon. And what I really love to do in my community storytelling and in my photos of my family members and just like people who I want to bring importance to in my images of them is I like to go a little bit low and look up at them so they get the same kind of treatment that kings and queens and presidents do. And so that's something that you might want to think about when you're photographing, like, for example, a grandparent or someone who you really value their story and that you want to bring importance to who they are and what stories they share is try to see if you can get a little lower in your angles of them so that you're kind of looking up at them. And I think it's a really nice way to kind of honor the people who are important in your life, or not necessarily people who are in your life, but just the community members that you meet and that you want to honor their story. And so here's just a few other images that I created once again with my camera that kind of showcase the different kind of angles that you can use. So this one image to the left, I was actually on assignment with this magazine called The Narwhal, and they asked me to photograph this incredible Indigenous woman who lives in North Vancouver, close to where I live. And she was sharing with me that this is her favorite building in the area of town that she lives in. And suddenly she just decided that she was going to offer thank you for this moment that we were in. And I suddenly was like, oh my goodness, I need to drop down. And so once I dropped down, I was able to kind of isolate her in the sky so that, alternatively, like if I'd stayed at eye level, you would have a lot of the background distracting away from this like incredible moment that she had done. And so I felt in that moment it was important for me to drop down so that I could really isolate this motion that she was doing. And in the other photo, I'm just using the lines again. I mentioned there are lines in every situation that we're in when we're outdoors. This is another situation where I was like, these lines are really interesting. Can I get them to lead right to her? And so that was another situation where I just thought, I'm going to drop down and, work with these lines to make this woman that I'm photographing kind of important and prominent in the frame. And so with that being said, this kind of brings me to my conclusion. And I think this is a great time to think about whether you have any questions or not about anything I said. I know I speak very fast during things like this, but I just really wanted to leave this time together with saying that if you have a phone, if you have an idea, if you have like an inkling in the back of your mind of a story that you feel is important to you, if you have a question or a curiosity that has been like an itch that you really want to like find out more about, that you can become a visual storyteller. That visual storytelling isn't just for people who are trained. It's not just for people who have expensive equipment. It's not for the select small group of society. Like anyone can be it, anyone can share their visual stories. And it's important for all of us to think about our family stories, our community stories, and how we can document them and how we can archive them. And it's incredible that there are places like Mika who are collecting stories, who are collecting history that's being created now and history that's in the past, so that for generations to come, these important stories can be seen and can be referenced and can be related to. And so I just leave this question with you. What story do you want to document? Because I know that in all of your lives, there is one. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for your time. And I look forward to chatting further in this little Q&A section.
Could you go to the next slide, Alia? But thank you so much, Alia, for such a wonderful presentation. I think I learned so much, and I was taking notes. I don't know if you saw I like to write on my notebook, but I was taking some notes. So thank you again so much for that. We do have some time for a Q&A if anybody has any questions for Alia in relate to anything that we spoke about today. Please put them in the chat, or you also have the ability to unmute yourself and ask your question as well verbally if you'd like. If you do, yes, thank you. Thank you for raising your hand, Candace. I was literally about to say, if you do have a question, if you don't mind using the raise hand function or messaging in the chat if you don't know how to use that function, we'll try to go in order. And again, if you do unmute or put your camera on, you will be in the recording as well. So we'll start off with Candace. Feel free to unmute or put your question in the chat. It's up to you.
Hi, thank you all so much. I'm actually a researcher and teacher in Los Angeles, but I kind of found out about this because I'm doing a little bit of research related to Mika and some Islam issues across North America. So I've been trying to beef up my Canadian knowledge, even though I went to McGill. But anyways, I actually came to this specifically because I was thinking about integrating some of these ideas into some teaching, like some classroom activities, because I teach courses across Islamic studies and material culture studies of religion. So I'm just curious, maybe for Alia, if you have any tips on kind of, or just experience in doing this maybe in a more undergraduate or high school level classroom as far as helping people tell their stories, because this fits a lot of my pedagogical goals as far as getting new perspectives into histories, especially of Islam. So just curious if you've had any experience doing any of these activities with undergraduates and maybe what advice you would have for helping them story.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I definitely have worked with high school students and undergrad students. Actually, recently, I had this wonderful opportunity to be a workshop facilitator for Rivers of Hope, which is an organization based out of Toronto that actually does a lot of workshop facilitation with Muslim youth. And I was coming in as a workshop facilitator to talk about how they can essentially also tell their own stories. And it was really wonderful because I was able to, over a few weeks, work with them and see what stories they came up with at the end. And I think a lot of how I framed the way I was speaking about photography and community storytelling in this works well with all different age groups. And so I can't say that I do something specifically very different with a high school age group. But I think it's often more so I like to, when I'm talking with that age group, talk about like, when do they feel the most belonging, or what is it that they're proud of in their family, or what histories have they noticed, or interesting stories have they noticed from family members, and to have them reflect often on the situations that they're in their own families and in their own communities. And often like beautiful stories get told about, and in, you know, surprising about like how different moments with their family members have really impacted the way they see their own culture or their own religion or whatever it may be. And then we talk about how we might want to translate this into photographs. And I find that when I do more in-depth photography workshops that are kind of based off the ideas that I shared today, that high school students take to that very well. And through the process of talking about the story it is that they want to talk about, and then getting to the photography aspect of it and kind of walking them through how they take the stories that are important to them, and how that might translate into images, and sharing a lot of examples of how other photographers have done it often resonates really well. So I don't know if that totally answered your question, but if you would like to chat more about what in specific you're doing, I'd be happy to email with you and answer anything else.
Thanks so much. No, I think that's helpful, but I might take you up on an email at some point, but thank you so much.
Okay, awesome. No problem.
And actually, then our next slide does have our everyone's contact info as well. So we'll move that. Oh, sure, you can do it. Yeah, you can do it now. No problem. So we have a question in the chat. Do you want me to read it, Alia, or are you okay?
Oh, maybe, sure. You can
I'll read it, no worries. Hi, Alia, thanks so much for this. Could you speak briefly about any documentation cataloging that you do with either the Sisters Project or Generations? I'm interested in how these stories are represented in archives, libraries, museums, and how their documentation or lack thereof can also contribute to the absence that you spoke about at the beginning. Mosca, you might also have some thoughts on how, oh, yes, okay. But yeah, you can go first, Alia.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so that's honestly, it's a great question. And it's something that I was thinking about in the preparation for this talk, is that I don't think actually any of my projects have so far entered into a physical archive. What I've done with each of them I've created like a very in-depth website that for each of the projects that has like, that almost is its own system where, you know, there are the images of the families and then there's the biographies that are written. And I often have people write to me, you know, referencing that they've used my websites for different purposes, for whatever it may be, whether it be like festivals, or it's someone's trying to find, you know, a person, like even like acting agencies sometimes, or like people have wanted to find like experts on Muslim issues, and you know, like my projects have definitely been used for a variety of different uses. So they are an archive in themselves online, but they haven't actually entered a physical archive yet. And that is definitely something that is a goal of mine to work on, because I believe that you're totally right. Like projects like this do get created, but if they don't get the support of institutions, they often don't necessarily get remembered in generations from now, or even, you know, years from when they're created. So I think that is a really good question. I think there probably needs to be, or there should be, more collaboration between artists and creators with institutions, and making sure that the community members who are making the art or creating projects or creating visual stories actually see their projects get some institutional backing in a sense. But Mosca, I'd be very interested in hearing what you have to say.
Actually, I was going to comment that so Alia's websites for each of her projects are beautiful and like beautifully curated, and they're yeah, I loved just the first time I encountered them. It was really awesome to just kind of, you know, like follow along this really beautiful flow of a story that was going on. So for each of them. So I just wanted to say that first, but as to your point about like even just like being having your material on a website, like you said, like they there's not I don't know if uh, you know the websites they do go away after a while. Like there's a lot of upkeep, and you do have to pay for the domain, the service. Making sure that it's hosted and all that stuff. And after a while, it can go away. So it is important to have some kind of like preservation plan or some kind of plan. As an speaking as an archivist, we think about preservation plans and making sure things are preserved in perpetuity, especially websites, especially digital objects. Um, but in terms of Mica, we are trying to. We know there's so many like archival storytelling initiatives, archival alternative archiving initiatives happening in Canadian Muslim communities. I know they exist and I've seen them. And I do follow them occasionally, and I try to keep up with them as much as I can. There's just a lot, and it's just for us. We're trying our best to connect with Canadian Muslim community organizations that are doing this work, and we're also trying to connect with artists as well. I know one of my goals for Mica in the future is to have connections with artists, perhaps maybe figure out an artist, like a kind of like an artist in residency program, commission artists to use our holdings and use our material to create whatever they want. And so we are trying to figure that out. And one of our main goals, again, like I said, is we like this webinar and the many that we've done in the past, we try to focus a lot on outreach as well, and getting into those spaces so that people know who we are. We're really proud of having a kind of like a community-driven, participatory approach to our work at Mica as well. So we have held like consultations with the community, and I do ensure that like the Canadian Muslim individuals that do donate to to the archives, that they are able to kind of have their have the what am I trying to say? Like I'm trying to ensure that their voices are also represented and in the archive as well. So one of the ways we try to do that is anybody who donates, for example, they have the option to also donate a video, audio, or even a written piece, or even just a Zoom recording like this, just talking about whatever they'd like related to the records. So they might have a couple boxes that they're going to donate to us, and what I really try to encourage them to do is also send in just an audio or video file of them just talking, or even an art piece. Even I'm okay. As anything honestly at this point, anything that they want to send in alongside their records donation that tells a story of their records, tells a story of their donation. So that's another one of the ways that we're trying to ensure that the voices of the donors the donors of records are included in the archive as well. So I hope I answered that question. Are there any other questions, folks?
I just wanted to say that was a really great question. Thanks, Jessica,
yes, it was.
for asking it. And I'm also wanted to just quickly apologize that I accidentally stopped sharing the screen. So
oh, it's okay.
If you are looking for some of the URLs, I am happy to reshare it, or I'm sure we can drop it into like chat.
Mm-hmm. And just to note that this recording will be on the Institute's website as well. So if you miss any information, for example, you can go back to that.
Oh, we just got another question.
Oh, okay.
Want to read it?
Sure, I'll read it. So the stories we try to tell through photography can be interpreted in many different ways and even be misinterpreted. True. So can you please share how we can use text to make sure that the stories of our subjects are perceived correctly, especially when they are meant to become part of archival records?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And for every project that I just referenced, I didn't really talk that much about the text, but if you do go onto the websites that I put onto the chat, you will find that there's actually a really heavy text component for each of them. So with both the Sisters Project and Generations, with every single family or woman I photographed, I would always do an interview component as well. And with the interviews and the biographies that I would create, I would often try my very best. Even, of course, everything is always subjective, and even the questions I ask have their own subjectivities to it and their own biases to it. But what I try to do for the most part with the biographies is to take my voice completely out of it as possible, and not to, I guess, to just try to allow the quotes to almost tell the story as much as possible. So with Generations, you'll find that I will sometimes just try to connect quotes like and ideas like to in order for the story to flow. But for the most part, I'm using just like 98% quotes from interviews that I've created. And in that interview, quotes from interviews I've conducted. And what I find is a really good practice for when I'm doing the actual interviews is I think common practice with interviews is that you record people, but I actually really like to send interview questions over Word docs so that people really have the time to reflect on what it is that they want to say. And I always allow space for people to add to that if they don't like a question or if they want to be asked a different question, that they let me know and that they share what it is that they want to come across. So it's through that I try my best to allow people to share their own stories and to give space for people to really take as much control of the narrative as they can. But of course, there is no system that is perfect when it comes to representation. I acknowledge that my own system, while it has worked for me, it also has its limitations, and that with representation, it's always going to be the best that you can do. And there's no such thing as making perfect projects or perfect representations. And I go by the practice of ongoing consent, so that if at any point any family or any person that has ever been a part of my project wants to change anything, no longer wants to be a part of it, wants to add something new, that door is always open. And that is my own way of trying to make sure that the people who are generous enough to take part in the work that I do, that they always feel that they have control over the narrative that exists out there about them and their own stories. So I hope that kind of answers your question, but I think what I guess I'm trying to say is there is no perfect way to deal with this, but there's always what we can just try to do the best. We can always just try to do the best we can and just try to make sure that it's as collaborative as possible with the people that we are working with.
Thanks, Alia. I think you said it best. There's no perfect way to do this, but that ongoing consent is a really great measure to have, because people change, they change their mind all the time, and it's important to be flexible when you do this kind of work, and absolutely something that we also adhere to as well at MICA. So I'm just looking at the time. We do only have a minute left, so I think that's all for today. Thank you all for joining. I want to thank everyone so much. I'd like to especially thank our guest Alia for sharing with us her amazing projects and for teaching us how every single one of us can be a visual storyteller. Thank you all for your insightful questions. And again, if you'd like to get in touch, the info is in the chat as well. Yeah, so thank you again. Have a wonderful night. Please look forward to our future events as well. And like I said earlier, this recording will be on YouTube page. So look out if there's anything specific that you wanted to go over again. All right, so again, thank you, Alia.
Thank you so much, Mika, for having me, and thanks so much, everybody, for spending the time tonight. I really appreciate it. Have a good night, everybody, and thanks again.